Well, thank you, Jill, and thank you everybody for staying for the afternoon. I know the after lunch hour is a little bit difficult, so I'll try to be animated and keep you engaged. And thanks to Allison Singer and the Autism Science Foundation for inviting me. It's really a pleasure actually to be here, but to be here in San Francisco, which is almost my hometown. In fact, I was born in San Francisco. And I don't have to travel back east, which I often do to give presentations, but I could just get up and get on the BART this morning and arrive on time, so it's great. So I'd like to start by having us all imagine a world in which all people with autism enjoyed good health and were completely integrated into the social fabric of their communities. Now, I really like that world, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the world we're currently in, and maybe how we can get there. So I'm going to start by telling a story about a young man named Eddie. Eddie comes from a close-knit middle-class family. At 2.5, he was diagnosed with autism. Like many autistic children, he had very minimal spoken language, and he was a pretty picky eater. In fact, he only ate 1 or 2 food groups. But Eddie had a lot of strengths also, and one of those strengths was that he just loved music. And in fact, at a certain age, at a very young age, he taught himself how to play the piano. Now, but as Eddie grew up, he started having a lot of health problems. In primary school, he suffered from a lot of diarrhea and constipation, and he often couldn't sleep at night. By middle school, he was feeling anxious. He didn't have too many friends, and he had difficulty at school. He was anxious, and he had periods of pretty severe depression. And by high school, like many autistic teenagers, he started having seizures. Now, in spite of his communication challenges, which he still continued to have, he had very limited verbal language, and he had very few friends, as I mentioned. He was able to connect with members in his community and at school through his music, and he often played at school events and at community events. When Eddie turned 21, he aged out of public school, and he officially became an adult. So what happens when children with autism become adults? Well, we know that in terms of employment, the majority of adults on the spectrum are either unemployed or underemployed. In terms of post-secondary education, we know that in spite of the fact that many youth with autism expect to go to college, most don't have the opportunity to do so. And we know that many autistic adults are socially isolated and don't have partners, or if they have had a partner, many report experiencing sexual abuse from those partners or being bullied by someone that they actually considered to be a friend. We've heard a lot this morning that health is really fundamental to our success in life in all these domains, in education and employment and being a functioning member of our society. But what I want to talk about is that adults with autism also have a very high burden of many different health conditions. These are data from a study that we collected in Kaiser Permanente, a study that we conducted among over 1,500 adults with autism, and compared these adults with autism to the non-autistic adults who were age and sex matched. These were all patients in Kaiser Permanente. And we were able to look at data that's collected through their routine care that's collected in their medical records. We had permission to do this. And what we found was that just about every medical condition was higher, it had been diagnosed more often in the autistic adults. These included conditions like gastrointestinal disorders, sleep disorders, seizures, things that we know that children experience. But this also included diseases that often have onset at older ages in adolescence or into adulthood. Things like hypertension, diabetes, obesity. We also found that many of the less common conditions were also occurring much more often and being diagnosed much more often in these autistic adults. And pretty disturbingly, over half of these adults with autism had a diagnosis of a mental health disorder, including anxiety and depression. And something that was really very disturbing was we found that suicide attempts or suicidal behaviors occurred at over 4 times as often in this adult autistic population than their non-autistic counterparts. So what's going on? Why are all these conditions co-occurring with autism in adults? Well, there could be several explanations. I've shown 3 possible explanations here. One says that shared genetics may be responsible, and that is that we've heard that autism is a highly genetic disorder. We also know that things like depression, which commonly co-occur in autism, also have a genetic underpinning. So it's possible that these 2 conditions might share some of the same genetics. Another possible explanation is shared environmental risk factors. So this example is showing that we know that air pollution, prenatal exposure to air pollution, has been shown over and over again to be associated with an increased risk for autism. We also know that air pollution has been linked to asthma, and again, asthma and autism sometimes and often occur together. And finally, a third possible explanation is behavioral factors, and that is that the consequences of being autistic, the social isolation, may prevent people from being able to participate in organized sports, for example, and lack of physical activity we know is a strong risk factor for obesity and diabetes. Other conditions that I've just shown you occur much more frequently in autistic adults. But why do we need to understand the mechanisms of this co-occurrence? Well, I think we've heard already today many times, we have a huge number of children who are growing up and becoming adults, children with autism. In fact, the latest number that I heard was about 70,000 to 100,000 children every year are turning 18 and becoming adults with autism. In order to serve this growing population of adults and meet their needs and be able to provide a healthy future, we need prevention strategies and treatment strategies that are targeted to this population. And to do that, we need to understand the mechanisms of this co-occurrence so that we can develop these targeted prevention and treatment strategies. But having the strategies isn't going to do much good if they're not in the hands of knowledgeable providers, and especially providers who are treating adults. So we wanted to ask, well, what do our providers know? We conducted a survey among the providers in Kaiser Permanente, Northern California. There are hundreds and hundreds of physicians, primary care physicians, OBGYNs, and mental health providers who deal with the adult population. And we did several interviews and we did a survey, and in the interviews we asked them, what kind of training did you get? And we heard over and over again, I see a lot of people shaking their heads or nodding, we didn't have any training in medical school, and we had no training during our residency. We did a survey and we asked the providers to rate their knowledge about providing care to autistic adults. It was on a 5-point scale from poor to excellent, and 20% said that they had good, very good, or excellent, good or better knowledge in providing care to autistic adults. And this is the good news. Only 6% rated their knowledge as very good or better. And the really bad news is that only 3% said they had excellent knowledge to care for their autistic adult patients. And I want to remind you that these were physicians rating themselves. So what are the key challenges that these providers face? Well, they don't have experience with autistic patients. They're getting it more and more every day, but so far they haven't had much experience, and so they don't know how to obtain a medical history or conduct an exam. And I think the number one challenge is about communication. So this doctor told us an interesting story, and it's pretty typical. He had a 25-year-old patient, a man who came into his office with as he said, a god-awful swollen arm. The man sat down. The physician tried to find out what happened. The patient couldn't really communicate. He was able to say, yes, it hurts, but that was it. And the physician said it was so swollen that any other patient with that kind of injury would have been in tears. And if it weren't that the arm was so swollen, the physician would have sent the man home without obtaining an x-ray. The second major challenge is about accommodation. How do we accommodate the unique needs of this patient population? And we know they have unique needs. So I want to remind you, or get back to that young man, Eddie, that I mentioned at the beginning. Well, his real name is not Eddie, and he's actually my nephew. Today he's 34, he's just about 35 years old. I'm happy to say that his seizures are under control, and he's sleeping about 8 or 9 hours a night. And he still avoids certain food groups, but he has been involved in Special Olympics for many, many years, and so he's able to maintain a healthy weight, and he's actually a pretty healthy guy. He lives at home, but he has a part-time job, and he has a part-time job doing something that he's truly passionate about, and that's playing music. He plays piano and leads sing-alongs in all of the local the local preschools in his community. In fact, the very preschool that he attended shortly after he was diagnosed with autism. So Eddie is very lucky to have a close-knit family, a supportive community, and healthcare providers, and a system that understands autism. But we know that all autistic adults are not that lucky. So what do we need to do? There's a lot of things that we can do, and I'm hoping that this crowd will start thinking and about things that they can do. But I think we need to address this gap in education. Providers need to understand autism. And how do we educate these healthcare physicians who are working with adults who really don't see that autism is in their purview? In fact, they say to us, I don't see kids. I don't see children, indicating that they think that they don't understand that children with autism grow up to be adults with autism. So we need education, and for that we need strategies to educate these providers. We also need tools to help patients and providers communicate, however they can communicate, but we need tools that will bridge that gap. And we need strategies for accommodation, for the healthcare providers to accommodate the patients, and for healthcare systems to accommodate these patients. We also need research into why all of these health conditions co-occur. And the research teams must include members of the autistic community who can share their lived experience and inform that research and make it the best that it can be. And finally, we need funding. So anybody out there? So in closing, I'd like to say that, well, right now the picture for autistic adults is not looking that rosy, but I think together with education and innovation and cooperation, we can really make that world we imagined a reality. Thanks very much.